Today we're going to discuss what happened with the fall. Prior to the fall, there was a great trust between man and woman, and also a great trust between the human person and God. When original sin came, that whole trust was ruptured. And as a result, there was a great disruption in the love between man and woman, and in the love between the human person and God. Where we're going to be going today with Christ and the Holy Father is back to that threshold between man and woman before sin and man and woman after sin, in order to help us locate ourselves in this historical reality we live in, and to heed Christ's voice so that we might recover that original nuptial spousal meaning of the body, and so love each other as God intends us to. When we look back at the Sermon on the Mount that Christ preached, Christ was giving us a new form of morality. The Jews, much like many people in our own day today, had thought that morality was just a bunch of norms, of commandments, of rules for them to follow externally. If you look at the Old Testament, there were 613 commandments there. And as Jesus described the Pharisees in the New Testament, they were ones who just wanted to keep the letter of the law, and they thought that if they kept the letter of the law, everything was fine in their relationship with God. Jesus wanted to take them back to not just norms or rules, but specifically to form men and women who were subjects of morality, men and women who chose to do the right thing. So in the Sermon on the Mount, he had a series of what biblical scholars call antitheses. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not kill." But I say to you, whoever hates his brother has already committed murder in his heart. Jesus wanted to take it from the norm of the fifth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," to the subject of morality, and make sure that he never even desires that type of thing. Jesus does the same thing with his teaching on sexual love. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So the lustful man is the one to whom Christ directs his words. And doubtless many of Christ's listeners on that mountain would have seen themselves singled out by the Lord, much like men and women of our day who are caught under the concupiscence of the flesh, who are caught under lust. Christ wants to take us beyond just merely keeping the sixth commandment externally and not committing adultery in the flesh, but he wants to form us as a subject who will be able to recover that nuptial love for the other person for which God created us in the beginning. But in order to understand in its depths what Christ was saying in the Sermon on the Mount, Pope John Paul II wants to take us back to the fall, back to the original sin of Adam and Eve, which explains how man became lustful in his heart over time. And in order to describe the effect, we have to go back to the cause. Let's head back to the book of Genesis. You remember what was said in the book of Genesis about the fall. God had given Adam and Eve everything, including his love, but had given them one boundary, that they were not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eventually the serpent came and tried to insert himself in that relationship of trust, that relationship of loving confidence between the created being and the created being's creator. He said, no, you shouldn't really trust God. He wants you not to become like him, and that's the only reason why he gave you this commandment. If you eat this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will become like God. And so Adam and Eve, disobedient, lacking the trust that they needed to have in God, took of that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and everything in their existence changed. What do we see as the dramatic immediate result? They became afraid. They became afraid of each other and hid themselves from each other, covering up the most distinctive parts of their body, because rather than having their bodies be a nuptial sign, calling each other to love, and something in which they look at themselves, summoning themselves to give of themselves to love, they started to see their body as something that could be appropriated by another. There was an incredible lack of trust between them, and that lack of trust invaded their relationship with God. They hid themselves even from God, such that when God came and said, "Where are you?" Adam said, "I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself." They were naked and now shamed. Points, Pope John Paul II says, to the radical corruption in the meaning of original nakedness. Original nakedness was supposed to be this great sign of love, but instead it became a sign of confrontation between man and woman. It was supposed to be an expression of the person's original goodness and the goodness of the original world. But man's relationship to the original world had changed. That's why God had told Adam after the fall, "You will now have to till the soil with your sweat." It would no longer bear fruit naturally and easily, but there had now been a discordance introduced between man and the created world. Beyond it, the original fruitfulness of human love, which was a natural outgrowth of their masculinity and femininity, their becoming one flesh in nuptial communion of persons, even that was disrupted when God said the consequence. It wasn't so much a penalty. God wasn't punishing Adam and Eve so much as just talking about the natural consequences of what their sin meant. That fruitfulness, which was a natural outgrowth, would now be brought about likewise in pain. That Eve would experience pain in childbirth, that it would no longer be the unceasingly and unmitigatingly joyous fecundity that God had intended from the beginning. And most importantly, sin caused a loss of the original certainty of the image of God expressed by the communion of persons in nuptial love. Man and woman no longer so easily saw themselves as made in the image and likeness of a God who is love, who is a communion of persons. This led to the second discovery of sex, John Paul says. The original discovery of sex was this great call to communion in the body, this personal communion that would be expressed in the sacrament of their making love together. The second discovery of sex, which comes now after the fall, was when Adam and Eve looked at each other and they covered themselves from each other. That the communion that was meant to be achieved in the nuptial union would only be incomplete until they were to recover that true freedom that comes from purity of heart, so that they could give of themselves totally over to the other and receive the other's gift totally and completely. There was a breakdown in that original communion, and man and woman have been suffering from that breakdown ever since. Where do we go from here? Christ takes us to the discussion of what real lust is. Lust is that original breakdown, that original sin and the consequences. St. John the Evangelist in his first letter described the consequences of original sin and said that it led to a threefold lust: a lust of the flesh, a lust of the eyes, and a pride of life. What St. John was pointing to was that lust changed who man was. Original sin transformed man from a lover into a luster, from a giver of himself and a receiver completely of who the other person is as a gift, to a taker of the other, to a user of the other. And so, what St. John says is, in this transformation of man's heart after the fall, he began to lust in his entire existence, not just in sexual appropriation of the other person, but also in his lust for money, in his desire to dominate other people, and his lust for power. Where Christ goes from here, and Pope John Paul II, based on Christ's words, we'll cover in just a minute.